The next day, malicious gossip would be whispered around to the accompaniment of frowns and raised eyebrows. That would be natural. Even he himself could not expect his eccentric vacation to have any other effect on his colleagues. Rarely will you meet anyone so jealous as a teacher. Year after year, students tumble along like the waters of a river. They flow away, and only the teacher is left behind, like some deeply buried rock at the bottom of the current. Although he may tell others of his hopes, he doesn't dream of them himself. He thinks of himself as worthless and either falls into masochistic loneliness or, failing that, ultimately becomes suspicious and pious, forever denouncing the eccentricities of others. He longs so much for freedom and action that he can only hate people. Was his disappearance accidental? No. If it had been an accident, there would have been some sort of news about him. Well, then suicide? But that would have involved the police, and suicide would be impossible. Don't overrate the foolish boy. Yes, indeed, he disappeared by his own choice. There's no need to root around anymore, but it'll soon be almost a week. He really is a scaremonger. I really don't know what he could be thinking of. It was doubtful whether they were sincerely worried, but at least their meddling curiosity was as overripe as an unpicked persimmon. Consequently, the next step would be for the headmaster to visit the police and inquire about forms for requesting an investigation. Behind his serious face, he would completely dissimulate the pleasure that was welling up within him. Full name: Nikki Junpei. Age: 31. Height: 5 feet 5 inches. Weight: 140 pounds. Hair: slightly thin, worn straight back, no hair oil. Eyesight: right 20/30, left 20/20. Color of skin: darkish. Features: long face, a slight cast to the eyes, snub nose, square jaws. No other special characteristics, es- except for a conspicuous mole under the left ear. Blood type: AB. Speaks thickly with a stammer. Introverted, stubborn, but not especially inept socially. Clothing: perhaps dressed for entomological work. The full face photograph attached above was taken 2 months ago. Of course, even the villagers must naturally have some countermeasure in mind, for they had dared involve themselves in such a mad venture. It would be easy to fool a couple of country policemen. They must have taken some precautions to prevent them from coming around on trifling matters, but this kind of smokescreen was necessary and effective only so long as he was healthy and able to stand the work of shoveling sand. It was not worth the risk of hiding a seriously sick person who had been laid up a week as he had. If they decided he was useless, it would be advisable for them to dispose of him at once before it became too troublesome. At this point, they could cook up a story. They might say that they had been seized by strange hallucinations caused by the shock of having fallen by himself into the hole, and this explanation would be far more acceptable than his own fantastic complaints that he had been trapped and imprisoned. Somewhere a cock crowed and a bull lowed shrilly, but in the sand hollow there was neither distance nor direction. The ordinary normal world was outside, where children played, kicking stones along the roadside, and where roosters proclaimed the end of night at the proper time. The colors of dawn were beginning to mingle with the fragrance of cooking rice, and the woman was ardently scrubbing him. After a rough wiping with the wet towel, she scoured him as she was polishing a window glass, twisting the towel tightly until it was like a piece of wood. In addition to the sounds of morning, The rhythmical sensation of the rubbing brought him little by little to an irresistible drowsiness. By the way, he stifled a yawn which seemed to be forcibly wrenched from within him. It's been such a long time. I would like to see a newspaper. What do you think? Do you suppose there would be any way of getting one? Well, I'll ask. Later. He realized very well that she was trying to show she was sincere. He was distinctly sensitive to her concern lest she hurt his feelings, which showed in the different tone of her voice. But it also irritated him profoundly. Would she really ask? Didn't he have the right to read the newspaper if he liked? He pushed her hands away, railing against her, carried away by an impulse to upset the wash basin and its contents. But getting angry at this point would spoil things. A seriously ill person would hardly get so excited over a newspaper. Of course, he did want to see a paper. If there was no scenery to look at, it was only natural to want to see a picture of scenery at least. He had read in various books how landscape painting had developed in naturally spare country, and how newspapers had come out of industrial areas where human relations were anonymous. Moreover, he might have the luck to find announcements of missing people, or better yet, an article of his own disappearance might even grace a corner of the social columns. Of course, the villagers cannot be expected to pass him willingly a newspaper which carried an article like that. In any case, patience was the most important thing now. Certainly, pretending to be ill was no fun. It was like holding a taut spring enclosed in your hand. You couldn't stand it indefinitely. He cannot let things go on as they were. He must really make them realize how responsible they were for him. He would see to it, starting this very day, that one way or another the woman would not get a wink of sleep. Don't sleep. You mustn't go to sleep. He stretched and gave a long, drawn-out groan. Under the umbrella that the woman had set up for him, he sipped the tongue-burning soup containing bits of seaweed. A precipitate of sand remained in the bottom of the cup. His memory had completely stopped functioning. Then it had gone confused with a long, oppressive dream. In the dream, he was astride an old, used chopstick, floating down some unknown street. It was not bad on the chopstick, rather like riding a scooter, but when he relaxed his attention, he suddenly lost his buoyancy. The street was a dull red near at hand, and in the distance a hazy green. Something in the combination of colors disturbed him. At last, he arrived at a long wooden building that looked like a barracks. The smell of cheap soap floated in the air. He mounted the stairs, hitching up his trousers, which seemed about to slip off, and came to an empty room containing only a long, narrow table. About 10 men and women were seated around a table enthusiastically playing some game. The player in the center was dealing cards from a deck. At the end of the deal, the dealer suddenly gave him the last card and cried out. He took the card involuntarily and looked at it. It was not a card at all, but a letter. The letter had a strange, soft feel to it. When he exerted pressure with his fingers, blood came spurting up. He screamed out and awoke. His vision was obscured by a dingy, mist-like film. There was a crackling noise of dry paper as he moved his body. His face was covered with an open newspaper. Damn! He had fallen asleep again. A film of sand fell from the surface of the paper when he brushed it aside. From the quantity of sand, it would seem that quite some time had gone by. The slant of the sun's rays piercing through the cracks in the wall told him it was about noon. But what was that smell? He wondered. New ink? Impossible, he thought. Yet he glanced at the dateline. Wednesday the 16th. It really was today's paper. It was unbelievable, but it was true. Then the woman must have passed along his request. He propped himself up with the elbow on the mattress, which had become sodden and sticky with perspiration. All kinds of thoughts at once began to whirl around in his mind, and he tried in vain to follow the print on the long-awaited newspaper. Increased agenda for the Joint Japan-America Committee. How in heaven's name had the woman managed to get her hands on this paper? Could it be true that the villagers were beginning to feel they owed him something? Even so, judging from how things had gone till now, all contact with the outside ceased after breakfast. Did the woman have some special way of communicating with the outside that he did not know of? Or, failing that, did she herself get out and buy the paper? It must certainly be one or the other. Drastic measures against traffic jams. But just a minute. Supposing the woman had gone out, it was inconceivable that she could have done it without the rope ladder. He didn't know how she had managed it, but one thing was certain. A rope ladder had been used. A prisoner dreaming of escape was one thing, but how could the woman, a resident of the village, put up with losing her freedom of movement? The removal of the rope ladder must be a temporary measure to keep him imprisoned. If that were so, and if he could keep them off guard, some day the same opportunity would occur again. Ingredient in onions found effective in treatment of radiation injuries. His strategy of pretended illness seemed to have produced an expected return. Everything comes in time to him who waits. They put it well in the old days. But somehow he did not react to the idea. Something in him was still unsatisfied. Perhaps it was the fault of that weird, terribly upsetting dream. He felt strangely uneasy about the dangerous letter. But was it dangerous? Whatever could it mean? However, there was no use worrying every time he dreamt something. In any event, he had to carry through what he had begun. The woman was asleep beside the sill of the raised portion of the floor around the hearth. She was breathing gently and lay curled in a ball, holding her knees as she always did. She had thrown an unironed summer kimono over herself. After that first day, she had stopped appearing naked before him, but under the summer kimono, she was probably as bare as ever. He glanced quickly at the society page and the local columns. Of course, there was no article on his disappearance, no missing person notice, but he had expected as much, and so was not particularly discouraged. He quietly arose and stepped down on the earthen floor. He was wearing only baggy, half-length drawers made of synthetic silk, and the upper half of his body was completely bare. It was definitely the most comfortable way to be. Sand had accumulated around his waist where he had tied the drawstring, and the skin there was inflamed and itchy. He stood in the doorway and looked up at the walls of sand. The light thrust into his eyes, and the surroundings began to burn yellow. There was not a sign of man or rope ladder. That seemed natural. He checked nonetheless, just to make sure. There was not even a sign that the rope ladder had been let down. Of course, with the wind like this, it wouldn't have taken 5 minutes for any trace to disappear. Just outside the doorway, the surface of the sand was continually being turned under as though there was some current. He came back in and lay down. A fly was flitting about. It was a tiny light pink fruit fly. Perhaps something was spoiling somewhere. After he had moistened his throat with water in the plastic wrapped kettle by his window, he addressed the woman. Would you mind getting up a minute? She jumped up, trembling, letting the summer kimono fall open to her waist. The veins stood up blue in the sagging, but still full, breasts. Flustered, she adjusted her kimono. There was a vague look in her eyes, and she did not seem fully awake yet. He hesitated. Should he question her now about the letter? Should he raise his voice in anger? Or should he adopt a mild inquiring tone at the same time, thanking her for the newspaper? If his goal were to simply prevent her from sleeping, then it would be best to go at it rather aggressively. He had missed the mark with his feigned illness, for his behavior was scarcely that of a man who had dislocated his spine. What he had to do was make them recognize that he was no longer of any use for work. At all events, get them to relax their vigilance. They had softened to the extent of giving him a newspaper. He had to break down the resistance even more. But he was summarily disappointed in his expectations. No, of course I don't go out. The men from the farm co-op happened to deliver some wood preservative. I ordered a while back and I had a chance to ask them. Only about 4 or 5 houses take newspapers in the village. They had to go all the way to the store in town to buy it. It was not impossible that things had happened so. It was rather like being shut up in a cell with a lock that had no key. If he and the people of the region themselves had to put up with imprisonment, then the precipitous wall of sand was no laughing matter with him. He became desperate and insistent. This is amazing. This is your house, isn't it? You're not a dog. It should be nothing for you to come and go freely, should it? Or have you done something so bad you don't dare show your face to the villagers? Her eyes opened wide in surprise. The glare was so strong that they were bloodshot and red. Certainly not. It's nonsense to think I don't dare show my face. Well, there's no reason for you to be so timid. But there isn't any reason to go out. You can at least take a walk. A walk? Yes, a walk. Wouldn't it be enough just to walk around a little? I mean, you used to take walks when you wanted to, before I came, didn't you? Yes, but I got all tired out, walking for no particular reason. I'm not joking. Ask yourself. You ought to understand. Even a dog will go mad if you keep it shut up in a cage. But I have taken walks, she said abruptly in her monotonous, withdrawn voice. Really, they used to make me walk a lot, until I came here. I used to carry a baby around for a long time. I was really tired with all the walking. The man was taken by surprise. Indeed, what a strange way of speaking. He was unable to answer when she turned on him like that. Yes, he remembered. When everything was in ruins, some 10 years ago, everybody desperately wanted not to have walk. And now, were they glutted with this freedom from walking? He wondered. And yet, even the child who wanted so desperately to go picnicking cried when it got lost. The woman suddenly changed her tone and said, "Do you feel all right? Stop looking so stupid." He was angry. He wanted to make her admit her guilt even if he had to force it out of her. At the very thought, his hair bristled and his skin felt scratchy like dry paper. Skin seemed to establish an association of ideas with the word force. Suddenly, she became a silhouette cut out from its background. A man of 20 is sexually aroused by thought. A man of 40 is sexually aroused on the surface of his skin. But for a man of 30, a woman who is only a silhouette is the most dangerous. He could embrace it as easily as embracing himself, couldn't he? But behind her there were a million eyes. She was only a puppet controlled by threads of vision. If he were to embrace her, he would be the next to be controlled. The big lie that he had dislocated his spine would at once be revealed in its true light. He cannot stand to have his life stop even in a place like this. The woman sidled up to him, her knees pressed against his hips, a stagnant smell of sun-heated water coming from her mouth, nose, ears, armpits. Her whole body began to pervade the room around him. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to run her searing fingers up and down his spine. His body stiffened. Suddenly, the fingers circled around to his side. The man let out a shriek. "You're tickling." The woman laughed. She seemed to be teasing him, or else she was shy. It was too sudden. He cannot pass judgment on the spur of the moment. What really was her intention? Had she done it on purpose, or had her fingers slipped unintentionally? Until just a few minutes ago, she had been blinking her eyes with all her might, trying to wake up. On the first night, too, he recalled, she had laughed in that strange voice when she had jabbed him in the side as she passed by. He wondered whether she meant anything in particular by such conduct. Perhaps she did not really believe in his pretended illness, and was testing her suspicions. That was a possibility. He couldn't relax his guard. Her charms were like some meat-eating plant, purposely equipped with the smell of sweet honey. First she would sow the seeds of scandal by bringing him to an act of passion, and then the chains of blackmail would bind him hand and foot. He was melting away like wax. His pores were gorged with perspiration. Since his watch had stopped running, he was not sure of the hour. Outside the 60-foot hole, it might still be full daylight, but at the bottom, it was already twilight. The woman was still lost in sleep. Perhaps she was dreaming, for her arms and legs twitched nervously. He had tried to disturb her sleep, but he had failed. As for himself, he had slept enough. He stood up and let the air strike his skin. The towel over his face had apparently fallen off when he turned in his sleep. So much sand had clung behind his ears, around his nostrils, and in the corners of his lips that he could scrape it off.